Our message today is about story, and in particular, how will we tell the story of this time? How will we tell the story of our times? At the beginning of the pandemic lockdowns, I remember the sharing of stories on social media and in traditional media of the flu pandemic of 1918. And I remember thinking then, I did not hear much about that in my history class. And yet, what a momentous world event that was. We didn't hear stories about the cities that did or did not lock down then and which were more successful at recovering afterwards. We began to hear those stories after this pandemic came. And, in that earlier pandemic, an estimated one third of the worldwide population caught that flu, and an estimated 20 to 50 million people died worldwide, including 675,000 Americans. Was this not as important as the wars that we slogged through in history class? Were there not lessons to learn from the pandemic as well? Well, I had actually heard a little bit about the pandemic at home. My father was a toddler in 1918, born the year before. He figured that he must have caught a mild case of that flu that year because, unlike anyone else in our family, he seemed to have a total immunity to every flu that went around for the rest of his life. He just didn't get flu when we all did, although he did catch the other diseases that were passed around. The ability of human beings to tell, remember, and retell stories is a key way that we have of learning and of passing on wisdom so that each generation doesn't have to learn it brand new. But if we don't pass on the stories, who is going to know? Formal history classes are one way that we try to teach the stories of the past. But if classes teach a one sided view of that history or omit it, the lessons learned might be the wrong ones. And for most students, hearing connections to their own story can make the history come more alive. My older son came home from school one day in the early 1990s. He was in high school taking American history, and he asked, "Mom, were you alive during the civil rights time?" And I realized he had not heard my stories of that time, nor had I passed on to him the stories my mother told me of a lesser known earlier history. My mother had participated in sit ins to desegregate restaurants in Minnesota in the 1930s. I grew up hearing those stories. I had forgotten until my son's question to pass those or my own stories on to him. There was another time he was in high school that same year when he asked whether we were alive during the Vietnam War. I had to tell him that he only barely missed being alive during that war himself because it ended just the year before he was born. Either we hadn't told enough stories or he missed them about how our lives were impacted, the impact on the lives of our friends and neighbors. The 1930s and World War II were alive for me, though I didn't live through them, through the stories that my parents told. But there were two stories about World War II that I did not learn. One until near the end of my father's life, the other almost 20 years after he died. Well, I did know this part. He knew when that war started that he could not fight in combat, and yet he believed that World War II was a just war. And so he found a way to serve not in combat. But this part of the story I didn't really know. He first signed up for a Naval Reserve unit that would provide medical care. Right after he finished medic training, he got a job in another state, and so he had to transfer to a different reserve unit. A month after he transferred, that first reserve unit he had been in was called to service and went to the Pacific, where they ended up captured by the Japanese troops and were part of the Bataan Death March. Most of his friends in that unit died. You know, I first heard that story from him almost 50 years after it happened. And suddenly, hearing it, a lot about my father made more sense. He had lived for 50 years with survivor's guilt, and never shared it before that. I think not even with my mother. Telling stories can help us make sense of traumatic or stressful times, help us manage our reactions to them, help us learn from them rather than being limited by them. By the end of his life, he really needed to tell that story to come to terms with it. After my father's last surviving sibling died, one of her daughters inherited our grandmother's carefully preserved letters of a lifetime. Among other treasures, this cousin made a book for me of all the letters, mostly from my father, but a few from my mother, that had been written to my grandmother. I'm sure Dad had to have written to my mother during those years, but those letters are lost. Those letters during World War II that he wrote to my grandma gave me more insight into my father. I could hear him in his own words at a time when he was young and still able to express his emotions. He spent a few months on a naval base in Virginia, and then this part I already knew. He spent 2 years in Trinidad, then was in London for the build-up to the Normandy invasion, though he was not himself part of the invasion. I already had a sense that for him, his service in that war was some of the most meaningful time of his life. But now I could actually read about his feelings and thoughts that he had at the time more directly. Nothing, though, was in those letters about that transfer in units and what it meant to him. That he had kept up locked inside. But in that collection of letters, I also found a letter telling me that second hidden story that I didn't know. A letter not from my father, Johnny, but from my mother, Betty, to Johnny's mother, Hannah. In it, my mother wrote of her sadness that Hannah, my grandma, would not be her mother-in-law and that she would not be marrying Johnny because she had decided to become engaged to someone else while he was overseas. What? That was a shock to me. Now, spoiler alert, I already knew that Betty ended up married to Johnny. They got married 3 days after he came back to the US after the war. But I'd always heard about Dear John letters, and obviously my own mother had sent one. And then in there's no letter to explain it, but somehow they reconciled, still separated by the war. Big story in there that I really wish I knew more about. Not a word about that disruption in their engagement was ever shared with us kids. The story that we tell ourselves then about the past does have some influence on our present, and we do make decisions with it. I've spoken before from this platform about the neuroscience of stories. Our brain has the ability, in fact, the inevitability of making up narratives to try to make sense of our experiences. It's one of the greatest gifts of our brain and sometimes a problem. Some of the narratives our brains make up are cohesive, that is, they hang together, whether accurately or not. Hidden stories that we haven't really processed fully tend to influence us anyway, subconsciously. Like those two stories probably influenced my father all his life. When we don't share our stories, we often don't go the extra step then of making the stories coherent and not just cohesive. A coherent story is one that has sorted out what happened, both factually and emotionally. A coherent story can be very healing and can be a source of human meaning. At the beginning of this pandemic, I remember reading and passing on even to the folks here in the Ethical Society some advice to keep a journal during this time. And of course, I did not do that. And I'm guessing many of you did not either. If any of you did keep a journal through this time, congratulations. In this last year, though, so much has happened. The pandemic, the lockdowns, our personal losses to COVID-19, the hopefulness of vaccination and the hopelessness of getting completely rid of the virus, and the George Floyd video, which somehow got through to many more people than other incidents of police violence had ever gotten through. We had a summer of protests, confrontations with police, an election which was made much more difficult by the pandemic, and then the unprecedented attempt to overturn a presidential election, which continues. People making job transitions during this time from one job to another, some to staying home, some to retiring. Two people I care a lot about are battling cancer during this time, unconnected to COVID, but complicated by it. Some babies have been born, some family members and friends have died, not all from COVID. Life and death go on, even when made more complicated by the other events. So you probably, through hearing just those short stories about my own family, got maybe some insights into me as well. Or maybe something I said reminds you of a story in your own life. I invite you, if the stories that I'm telling have touched any painful memories for you, to be tender with yourself and take a few deep breaths. We all have the opportunity to help ourselves, each other, and future people find meaning and make sense of what has happened if we tell our stories. So I'm going to challenge each and every one of you. Tell one or more stories about this time. The weaving together of the many stories we tell itself will tell a story of this time. Now, I know many of you are sitting there saying, you're not a writer. But certainly my father was not a writer when he wrote those poignant letters. So I ask you to imagine now that you're writing a letter and write your story that way. And then think about who might you be writing this letter to? If not to someone specific in your life, then imagine some reader in the future who might pick it up. I have a new grandchild on the way later this year, so I will write to my grandchildren's children and to my niece's grandchildren when I write my letter. And I'm also writing for anyone who happens on the story. It won't be anything grand, just a story or two. Now, for those of you who are present in the room today live, I'm actually going to make it possible for you to begin weaving this fabric of stories in a few minutes. And for those we have email addresses for, I'll be inviting the rest of our community to participate later. And I want us to remember too that, as some of you reflected in the opening section, our children also have stories. Parents may need to help them to tell those stories, may need to help them even to write it down. But those stories will also speak to that child's future self, help them make sense of their life and their feelings later about this weird time in their childhood. Making sense of our stories is part of resilience. It's a gift to a child to help them tell the story from their own perspective. And if the child and parents choose to share those stories, it's a gift to the larger community to see those times through their eyes. And in fact, it's a gift for any of us to try to tell a factual and emotionally honest story of this time, for ourselves and for future people to sort out what really happened. What was it like? What lessons can be learned? Stories help us unlock meaning and move forward in healing. And it is in that spirit that I recommend to everyone listening to this, start writing and start with just one story. No need for some literary perfection. Just be real. Describe what happened. Tell about the senses that were engaged for you. Tell about your emotions that were engaged. Tell about what you saw and heard. And do share it. It is through sharing of stories that we learn from each other and are able to imagine a better future than might have been possible. For those of you watching on video, we invite you to join some Sunday for a more participative experience. You can find out more about our ethical society at rysec.org.